All right. Yeah, I'm back again for another video here. I'm gonna see how far I can get in the study guide. I haven't gotten it done in one video yet. I had to do a little two-parter action on the last one, so I'm gonna try to get it all done here. So might be rushing a little bit, but feeling feeling a bit better. Getting more comfortable with the material. Definitely been adding quite a bit to the PowerPoint the past couple days. Just trying to beef it up and cover some bases and just it helps quite a bit, honestly, just being able to reference that when I need to. So yeah, I'm just gonna get started here. I'm gonna start from the front and work to the back. So yeah, question number one: explain the ESA's jeopardy and consultation provisions, section 7. Why are these provisions so significant to understanding decision making pertaining to federal public lands? Please use an example in your answer. So section 7A1 establishes affirmative duties that federal agencies shall take to do more than just avoiding causing more harm. Yeah, and then you also got in that section 7 as well. You have that jeopardy provision. That requires an agency that any that any any agency ensure that any action they authorize, fund, or carry out is not likely to jeopardize the continued existence of a species or result in the destruction or adverse modification of habitat for such species. So then it further goes on to the consultation provision, which requires that an action agency that is authorizing said action, maybe they believe that there's a potential that they're going to actually it requires that action agency to consult with either the Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA, the two administering agencies of the ESA, on how to avoid jeopardy, they might conduct, do they need to conduct a biological assessment? If they conduct that biological assessment and they find that it's likely to potentially jeopardize a listed species, then they're going to have that formal consultation with either the FWS or NOAA, and then they'll conduct their biological opinion, and then from there they'll either administer some RPAs and possibly an incidental take statement as well. And I think, let's see, here's kind of just setting up the scene slide, just broad, what we're covering throughout this exam. It goes from the ESA down to the Wilderness Act, and we cover the Antiquities Act in there as well as the national parks in the middle. And I think I do. Okay, yeah. So kind of here's that procedural section 7, which I kind of just walked through briefly there. An example of this section 7 jeopardy and consultation in action. We could go to the TVA versus Hill case of 1978. A textbook case. We hit this pretty hard. I've hit this pretty hard in the past couple of videos, but you have that Little Tennessee River TVA dam building. Building a dam, constructing a dam in the Little Tennessee. Funding approved. Funding approved in 1966. The work began in 1968. NEPA comes out and is released in 1970. They halt the dam just to conduct the EIS. EIS is completed in 1973. Then the snail darter subspecies is discovered. Snail darter subspecies is discovered in the Little Tennessee River, and then is subsequently listed as endangered in 1975. The Little Tennessee River is then designated as critical habitat for the snail darter, the endangered snail darter. So there's the University of Tennessee law student Hiram Hill argues and challenges that building the dam could destroy that critical habitat of the snail darter. And then he argues that it's construction of this dam is direct violation of Section 7. So, and then TVA comes back and they argue that, already $80 million has been spent on this dam. We're already well into construction, and we already have, we have funding that's continually approved by Congress. So, in the end, the courts end up halting the TVA dam project in the decision, on the basis that construction of the dam would adversely affect the critical habitat and jeopardize the continued existence of the snail darter, i.e., yes, they were in violation of Section 7, the jeopardy provision. in this case kind of establishes the the power that Section 7, the teeth of Section 7, or the teeth of the ESA and the power of Section 7, that jeopardy provision. And this is kind of how the ESA gets that pit bull of environmental law reputation. Yeah, I mean it allows the courts to halt federal actions if Section 7, that jeopardy and consultation provision is not met. And it also showed that you can't jeopardize the continued existence of a listed species regardless of the prominence of that species. A snail darter, very small little fish. Not nobody knew what it was before this case. I didn't know what it was. What I had heard of darters and stuff like that, but I didn't really know what the snail darter was until reading about this. But so it shows that the ESA doesn't just pertain to those big icon, American icon species, but also all the way down to they can halt a multi-million-dollar dam, tens of millions of dollars dam, just for this little endangered snail darter. What is a biological opinion in the context of the ESA? Describe a real or hypothetical example of how a biological opinion could impact a proposal or decision by the U.S. Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, or National Park Service. Be sure to reference an incidental take statement / permit and reasonable and prudent alternatives somewhere in your response. So this one, like I said, I kind of touched on a little bit in that last answer. But essentially, so first things first, your action agency, they're looking to do some sort of action or provide funding for something or something, they're going to do an action in a location. So they just kind of inquire with the Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA, whoever, jurisdiction, if it's terrestrial, it's going to be Fish and Wildlife Service. So most cases, at least pertaining to, Montana, it would be, a lot of Fish and Wildlife Service. But anyways, they consult, they just inquire with Fish and Wildlife Service, hey, we're considering doing this here. Are there any potentially listed species that we need to be aware of, be concerned of, consider in our planning? And if so, Fish and Wildlife Service is like, yeah, there's some of these around there. There's some of those. It kind of, we've monitored some, tracked some through there. So if so, then that action agency has to conduct a biological assessment, which is an informal consultation. And this is just the agency itself conducting this, and it's simply to determine if that those potentially those listed species in the area identified by the Fish and Wildlife Service are going to be affected by the action. And then if in that biological assessment they do find that this action is going to affect that listed species, then we got to do a formal consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service, in which the Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA will conduct a biological opinion. And the biological opinion essentially just decides whether that action is likely to jeopardize the continued existence of that, of the listed species or result in adverse modification / destruction of habitat. So essentially it's that jeopardy, the biological opinion is checking that the action is not going to violate that Section 7 jeopardy clause. That is what that biological opinion is looking for. All right, and then so going from here, if so the Fish and Wildlife Service conducts a biological opinion, and maybe it does find that it finds in its biological opinion that the action is going to negatively affect or could potentially jeopardize or adversely modify that habitat. So they're going to suggest some reasonable and prudent alternatives, and possibly issue an incidental take statement as well. And those reasonable and prudent alternatives are essentially mitigation measures that agency can take in that action to minimize any potential, to avoid that jeopardy or adversely, to limit the adverse modification to that habitat or avoid jeopardizing that species. And like I said, also, they might also maybe they don't find that in their biological opinion, they don't find that action is going to jeopardize the species as a whole. It's not going to adversely modify the habitat. But so they will issue an incidental take statement. Maybe they find that a few of those endangered species are going to get caught in the crossfire. So they issue that incidental take statement, which it's just concludes that the taking of a listed species is going to be incidental to the, to the action. It's not going to be, it's not, yeah, it's incidental. That take is going to be incidental, and it just specifies the impact of the incidental take, reasonable improvement of alternatives, kind of throw in there again. I don't know why I put those in there again. And then it also, that incidental take statement sets forth terms and conditions that must be complied with uh, by the action agency. I put in a piece of gum before I started this, and now I'm trying to just like store it in my cheek, and kind of annoying. Anyway, and then was there an example that he wanted with this one as well? Yeah, okay. So here I kind of dug up the Southwest Center for Biological Diversity versus the Bureau of Reclamation case. Anyways, Bureau of Reclamation, they're in charge of Lake Mead, and I think it's the Hoover Dam there. I've been going off that for the past like 3 videos now, and it would literally take me 2 minutes to look that up, but I'm confident that it's the Hoover Dam. I'm not sure on it. Anyways, so the Bureau of Reclamation, they're doing some stuff, down below the dam that's maybe gonna impact the water levels of the river below as well as the lake itself. So they contact the Fish and Wildlife, or they conduct their own biological assessment, and they find that it might their actions are going to potentially affect those endangered flycatcher birds. So they contact the Fish and Wildlife Service. The Fish and Wildlife Service comes out and they conduct their biological opinion. They do find, they concur with the Bureau of Reclamation, and they find that the activity is going to potentially jeopardize or adversely modify that flycatcher habitat. So the Fish and Wildlife Service then proposes some reasonable and prudent alternatives with mitigation measures. And it essentially, what these RPAs are, or RPA is that it's a requirement that the Bureau of Reclamation procure and protect 1,400 acres of currently unprotected riparian area or riparian habitat. It doesn't provide, in the RPAs, no specific or suitable areas are identified in that RPA, and there's no mandate in that RPA either that habitat be established before the destruction of the Lake Mead habitat. The only there's just a couple stipulations. Like one of them is that 500 acres of that 1,400 needs to be in place by January 1st, 1999. So there is a mandate that it needs to be in place by a certain date. And then then the remaining 900 acres needs to be in place by January 1st, 2001. And then there's also a second little mandate here where there needs to be an initiation of a necessary ecological restoration and reforestation as well. And then there's some additional on and off-site compensation for historical flycatcher habitat that was lost, as well as continued development of the multi-species conservation program. And then the Fish and Wildlife Service, with their biological opinion and those RPAs, did issue a incidental take statement to the Bureau of Reclamation, and it was permitted. They were permitted in this statement for the incidental taking of an unquantifiable take of flycatcher, and that would be a hard thing to quantify in this scenario because it is, it's the level of the lake that's going up and down, and essentially I think what those flycatcher, from what I remember from the reading at least, they like those riparian areas that are, those riparian, I'm guessing it's cottonwoods and willows along the the edge of that lake, really right up on the waterfront. And as that lake, I think they're projecting, the expectation was that their actions downstream were going to cause the lake to go up, and as that lake goes up, it inundates that with those willows and cottonwoods, and it was going to be for a period of time that they couldn't sustain that. So they would, it would kill those willows and cottonwoods, and therefore, it would destroy that habitat, as well as there was, as those cottonwoods and willows die, they're going to be more susceptible to blowdown, or just as that, there's potential for them to come down, and then I think that was kind of one of the reasons they gave them that unquantifiable incidental take statement, because as those trees come down, there could be flycatcher nests in those trees, and that would be a hard amount of flycatcher to quantify if you have nests with eggs or hatchlings in those. So I think that was the reason between the unquantifiable incidental take statement. What is the primary difference between listing and managing a species as endangered and threatened pursuant to the ESA? Be sure to discuss the issue of management flexibility in your response. So, an endangered species is a, I got a slide for this, I know. Somewhere, oh, there it is, past it. Alright, so yeah, an endangered species is any species which is in danger of extinction throughout all or a significant portion of its range. And these endangered species, let me shuffle out of the way a little bit. These endangered species come with that Section 9 protection, which I haven't talked about yet. We'll come up to it, though. Anyways, the Section 9 takings protection, that comes with that endangered species listing. And, as was established in the Palila versus Hawaii Department of Natural Resources case, which I'll also come up on here in a little bit. But that the extension of harm to include, habitat modification, which would result in direct taking of, killing of a species as well. So kind of that indirect taking, through that new definition of harm. So there's definitely, when you have a listed, endangered species, there's definitely more or a lot less management discretion when you have to worry, be concerned about that Section 9 takings prohibition and that extension to the destruction of habitat for those endangered species as well. Then your threatened species are any species that are likely to become endangered within the foreseeable future throughout all or a significant portion of its range. These do not, with listing, do not come with that Section 9 takings protection, but that protection may be extended via Section 4D by the Secretary. So yeah, the threatened species, they don't come with that Section 9 takings protection, which that means they don't have that Section 9 harm, indirect taking, habitat modification protection as well. Both of these threatened and endangered listings do come with that Section 7 jeopardy and consultation protection. So essentially, yes, with the endangered species, there's a lot less management discretion compared to the threatened based on that takings protection. Explain the ESA's take provision and how it relates to harm, and thus land use and or water management. Be sure to discuss the ESA and ESA regulations pertaining to take in your response. Provide an example of an indirect take in your answer. So the take provision, Section 9. I don't know if I had a slide for this, but maybe. Yeah, okay. So Section 9, the no takes provision. Unlike Section 7, this applies to not only federal but state and private actors. So this extends to everybody. And anyway, so yeah, not just listed. But it only does apply to that endangered species upon listing. Like I said, that listed species or threatened species can have this protection extended to them by the Secretary. And then, okay, so take, as described in statute, is to harass, harm, pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, trap, capture, collect, or attempt to engage in any such conduct. So all of those are pretty uneasy to kill, shoot, wound. Like those are all direct takes. The reducing a wildlife to a possession by capturing or killing it. But so all of those, pretty much all of them, with the exception of harm, are pretty straightforward. It's not hard to understand what those are. Then it with harm, there's definitely a bit more ambiguity, and that's where we kind of get into that the extension using harm to extend to indirect takes. And, we saw that in the Palila versus Hawaii Department of Natural Resources case, like I just mentioned previously, in which the Hawaii Department of Natural Resources introduces these feral goats for recreation, to promote recreation on the island, hunting of those feral goats. Those feral goats go around and they start eating up all these mamane tree shoots and seedlings. So, they're just eating these little seedlings and shoots. Now, the endangered Palila bird requires the mature mamane tree in order to for food and for shelter primarily. So the the Hawaii Department of Natural Resources is taken to court. The plaintiffs argue, and I think it was I'm positive it was Sierra Club. Yeah, Sierra Club takes the Hawaii Department of Natural Resources to court and litigates them, arguing that by browsing, the goats have impaired the critical habitat of the Palila bird. In turn, the courts do side with the Sierra Club, and they rule in favor of that, of their argument, and they state that yes, the Mamane forest is essential for the Palila's survival. The bird is co-evolved or has evolved in the Mamane ecosystem over the centuries and is uniquely adapted to feeding upon the Mamane. The Mamane trees provide food, shelter, and nest sites for the Palila. So, in this case, they extended, and I think they were remanded, and the Hawaii Department of Natural Resources had to remove all the goats from the island. And they were guilty of a Section 9 violation. They were guilty of a taking. So essentially, in this case, they showed, they used harm, the definition of harm, to extend to, the destruction of habitat, or the destruction of habitat for future birds. Those future Palila. Those little seedlings and saplings, they weren't providing anything for the current Palila, but by the goats eating them, they were harming the future prospects for Palila, the endangered Palila on the island. Following this case, the Fish and Wildlife Service, they issue new regulations defining take. In the case, they cited the Fish and Wildlife Service's, regulations defining take as significant habitat modification or degradation, and that's what I guess they were, they reached out to include this eating of these seedlings and saplings in this case. Anyways, following this case, the Fish and Wildlife Service does promulgate a new regulation defining harm. That's found in the definition of take. Here's the new definition of harm in the regulation issued by the Fish and Wildlife Service. Quote, act that actually kills or injures wildlife. Such act may include significant habitat modification or degradation, where it actually kills or injures wildlife by significantly impairing essential behavioral patterns, including breeding, feeding, or sheltering. So with this new regulation, it shows that because by eating those seedlings and saplings, they're impairing that impairing that significant habitat. They're modifying, degrading it, and that's definitely gonna impair those essential behavioral patterns of those Palila in the future. I don't think I explained that very well. I think I gotta go into this one and kind of redo it. Yeah, I don't like my answer there. It just feels a little bit shoestring or something. Moving on. What is the best available science mandate of the ESA? Do I got a slide for this? Probably not. I don't know. Oh, kind of here. So, the best available science mandate for the ESA essentially requires that the secretary solely consider the best available science when listing when deciding to list a species. And I guess to quote, using solely the best available scientific and commercial information. And in this best available science mandate, Congress, directed that listing be a fundamentally scientific question. There's not that economic cost-benefit analysis when listing or anything like that. It's solely best available science. What ESA provision permits the Fish and Wildlife Service to delist grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem while keeping the species listed as threatened in the Northern Continental Divide ecosystem? I do have a slide for this one, I know. So this comes down to the distinct population segment provision in the listing criteria. But anyways, yes, these distinct population segments are groups of the same species that occupy geographically discrete areas, and it's in the definition of a species. It extends, or it's only extended to vertebrates. This distinct population segment breakdown is extended to vertebrates because species, I think, can, it's, species, subspecies, and then, yes, in the case of vertebrates, it can be broken down further into these distinct population segments. And this is just to provide more flexibility in those different levels of protection to less than a whole species. So, like in this case, yes, you have you got a population of grizzlies up here in the northern continental divide, and then you got another species of here in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So yeah, and I guess like here up here in the I was reading this, so they have the 1996 policy. I think this is essentially to determine what is a distinct population segment, and there's pretty much just two things. They must be discrete and they must be significant, and they define discrete as just based on separation from other groups of its kind. So here, and obviously in this case, yes, there's separation between the greater Yellowstone and the northern continental divide grizzlies, and then they also have to be significant. And this essentially states that the segment's demise must be an important loss of genetic diversity. And this one, I'll admit, like this has got I'm not as clear on the second criteria, but like the segment's demise must be an important loss of genetic diversity. So it's like, would it, so maybe there's a different, it's gene, so if it were to be lost, the species as a whole would lose genetic diversity. So if that segment were to be lost, so if the Northern Continental Divide segment was lost, distinct population segment was lost, it'd be a loss of genetic diversity for the species as a whole. Okay, I'll have to think on that one a little bit. But yeah, so essentially, like I said, gives flexibility to provide those different levels of protection to the not just below just the species level. They can go to the distinct population segment level, and so then yes, this would mean that they could potentially delist a distinct population segment here in the greater Yellowstone while still leaving these as listed. Describe a real or hypothetical example of how a decision to list or not to list a species pursuant to the ESA could be challenged in court using the Administrative Procedure Act. Be sure to sufficiently explain the best available science mandate and arbitrary capricious clauses of the ESA and APA in your response. So for this one, back to the Northern Spotted Owl versus Hodel Test 1 review a little bit. But anyways, so Fish and Wildlife Service is petitioned to review the Northern Spotted Owl for potential listing. Fish and Wildlife Service initiated the status review of the Northern Spotted Owl, assembles a team of biologists, including Dr. Mark Schaefer, i.e. this is kind of their, using their best available science, bringing together this team. Dr. Schaefer and his biologists come to the conclusion that the continuing of the old-growth logging is likely to lead to the extinction of the subspecies of the northern spotted owl, and argues strongly for the listing of the northern spotted owl in their conclusion. The Fish and Wildlife Service then has this conclusion peer-reviewed. They do some due diligence. Like, okay, yeah, sounds good. We're just going to have a couple other people take a look at it. Some population viability experts, get some other eyes on it. And the other scientists, the peer reviews come back and they concur with the conclusion and, second the motion. And, then, okay, following this, Fish and Wildlife Service completes the status review, announces the decision, and its listing is not warranted at this time. So, the decision is then challenged. Northern Spotted Owl. Was it Sierra Club again? No, I don't know. I can't remember this one. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But anyways, the decision is challenged and reviewed under the APA, Administrative Procedure Act, and under the Arbitrary and Capricious Standard. And essentially, yes, like we said, the agency, the APA Arbitrary and Capricious Standard is where, the agency has failed to make that, APA standard, hold unlawful and set aside agency action, findings, and conclusions to be arbitrary and capricious, where there's maybe that lack of a rational connection between the facts found and the decision made, potential clear error in judgment, or, maybe an agency overlook of an important aspect of the problem. And in this case, the Fish and Wildlife Service didn't provide that rational connection between the best available science, that team of science, that team of scientists, Dr. Mark Schaefer, and the conclusion that they came to, and the decision they made not to list the northern spotted owl. And so then, without providing that rational connection, the courts then found them guilty of being arbitrary and capricious in their decision, and were remanded and had to redo it essentially. And they did. I think it was on the remand that they did end up listing the northern spotted owl as endangered. So yeah, just kind of going back to that best available science provision, like I discussed in the last question, but it's that listing of a species solely based on the best available scientific and commercial data available. That listing should be strictly a scientific decision, not like don't include economics in it or other considerations, special interests. And like I said, the Fish and Wildlife Service in this case brought in a team of scientists, and I see that as them they use best available science. They brought in this crew, and in to make this decision, and they went and then in the end they ended up going against that the conclusion that best available science the scientists came to, and were ruled arbitrary and capricious under the APA. And then kind of just going back to the APA, just bring it all together. So that arbitrary and capricious standard, hold unlawful and set aside agency actions, findings, and conclusions found to be arbitrary, capricious, and abuse of discretion or otherwise not in accordance with the law. It's a narrow scope of review. Not it's just looking at how the agency came to the decision. It's not whether the decision. It's not like. I don't need to go into that, but it's a very narrow scope of review. And the agency needs to provide that rational connection between the facts found, decision made, or it's reviewing was there a clear error in judgment, or did the agency overlook an important aspect of the problem. And in this case, like I said, there was definitely a lack of that rational connection. And you could say that they maybe because following the remand and going back and reviewing the species, they did end up listing the species, so maybe they just completely overlooked something. So or there was that just clear error in judgment. I guess it's pretty easy to say that there was, but what is a citizen provision as found in the ESA? So citizen provision essentially is just that any citizen can petition for a species to be listed under the ESA, so it essentially it's that provision that allows citizens to petition the Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA for a species to be listed, and the Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA has 90 days to post. It has 90 days post petition to determine whether the petition is warranted, unwarranted, or warranted but precluded due to other agency priorities. With sufficient detail, describe an example of how the ESA has moved from being a strictly prohibitive law to one that is more permissive in nature. Be sure to discuss or reference Tennessee TVA v. Hill somewhere in your response. I guess I got like 2 slides that kind of apply to this one, but I'll start on the TVA v. Hill one. Grab a drink of water real quick. Alrighty. Let me just reread the question. Okay, gotcha. Alright, so I'll just start off with the TVA, just doing a brief rundown of TVA versus Hill again. Okay. Well, in the TVA versus Hill case, I guess I'll go prior to TVA versus Hill, and then TVA versus Hill, and then post TVA versus Hill, because that's kind of a good way of showing how the ESA moved from prohibitive to maybe a little more permissive. But in the original 1973 ESA, signed by Tricky Dick, anyway, In the original 1973 ESA, we're bringing back that. You remember that best available science mandate from the listing decision. Well, in the original ESA, that best available science was also applied to the designation of critical habitat. And as a species is listed, critical habitat, which is ensures that there's adequate food and shelter for that listed species, is required within 1 year, to go along with a listed species. So you list a species, you also have to designate critical habitat within 1 year for that species. And at the original passing of the 1973 ESA, that critical habitat mandate, habitat was also only determined on solely best available science. So, going on to TVA versus Hill now. You have that snail darters listed as endangered, and that stretch of the Little Tennessee where that dam is designated as critical habitat. So, the dam, and like I said in the court decision, it's determined that the dam would cause adverse modification of critical snail darter habitat. And even with that work, well underway, $80 million spent, continue funding already, authorized by Congress. They are ruled that they violated Section 7 of the ESA. They're enjoined on their progress. It's determined they're going to adversely modify that critical habitat. They're going to jeopardize the snail darter. So it's enjoined by Congress, and that dam is halted. And all that, I guess that money, that $80 million essentially thrown down the river. And that's, there's definitely, following that case, there's, some pretty big controversy. People, this kind of, people see this and, they have to take a step back, looking at the paper, a little bit of surprise, that the ESA's got this kind of power, and definitely caught some people off guard. So 1978, there's some, it caused the, Congress to respond, and in 1978, they released some amendments to the ESA post TVA versus Hill. And essentially, they changed the critical habitat designation, mandate. So it still has to be done within 1 year, although that's also changed quite a bit in, the years following this. I think in the reading they talk about how there's, a large percentage of listed species don't have that critical habitat. It's just not as high a priority. And so that's even kind of fallen to the wayside. But off topic, getting back to this. So 1978 ESA amendments post TVA versus Hill in response to kind of the backlash, surprise of the nation. The critical habitat designation is no longer based solely on best available science, but then there's also the consideration of economics, that cost-benefit analysis, or any other relevant impact, of specifying any particular area as critical habitat. So yeah, there's that. I don't know why I got Northern Spotted Owl versus Hodel in this one. To be honest with you, I'm not really sure what that's doing there, but just ignore it. I don't know why that's on this slide. But anyway, so that's changed. So no longer are they just determining this best available science, or this critical habitat on best available science, but it's now cost benefit, which would have definitely probably impacted the, if this had been done pre-TVA versus Hill, they might not have designated that Little Tennessee River stretch as critical habitat if they were also considering the, holy cow, we already spent this much money on the dam, maybe we don't give a crap about the snail darter as much, or the critical habitat of the snail darter, I guess. But anyway, and then additionally, the 1978 amendment also created this God Squad committee who may vote. Dang it, it got cut off. All right, anyway. But who may vote to exempt an action from Section 7. Actually, where am I at on here? Okay. Oh. Yeah, it formerly called the Endangered Species Committee, but may vote to exempt an action from Section 7 authority if there are no reasonable and prudent alternatives, and the benefits of the action clearly outweigh the costs. Again, if that had been pre TVA versus Hill, well, I guess no. You know what? No, actually, we'll kind of get to that. But or the action is of regional or national significance, and I think that third one has kind of to do with like a national security, more like military, background. But anyways, this God Squad or Endangered Species Committee is made up of the secretaries of it's a big crew that they got on this team, but it's secretaries of Agriculture, Army, Interior, administrators of NEP or the administrators of the EPA, NOAA, chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, state representatives appointed by the president. So it's you got a lot of different pieces of government from different sectors coming together on this. So it's definitely a little more a little bit of a mix. Lots of different interests. Possibly competing, but lots of different interests involved in the process. So definitely moving away a little bit from that. Continuing to showing that trend of moving away from the that best available science to maybe also considering some other factors here. And but still, this God Squad brought together, and I guess they must have just kind of re-reviewed the TVA versus Hill case, but they came together even on the TVA versus Hill and still upheld the decision of the Supreme Court in that case. So they even still found it to be an egregious act. As it applies to the ESA, what is a candidate species? Do I got a slide for this one? Going the wrong way. So, a candidate species is warranted but precluded by other agency priorities. So it's effectively placed on hold, and the federal agencies, while it's in the waiting room, may pursue a strategy to improve the status of the species. So this is a species that's been petitioned for, but the whether it be limited by resources or they just maybe it isn't quite to that point where they're going to list it. They kind of just put it on hold. That it's warranted but precluded, and like I said, effectively put on hold. It's just kind of in the lobby or waiting room outside the listing office. And so, but even if it is, federal agencies might pursue strategies to prevent it from being listed, and take steps to keep it from being listed. I think that's pretty much all I got on this one, and it's a short question. What ESA provision helps protect geographic areas, occupied and unoccupied, that are essential to the conservation of a listed species? How does the designation help achieve the fundamental purpose of the ESA? Do I got a slide for this? I don't know if I do. I don't think I do. I think I'm pretty much through the ESA slides, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. Okay. Okie doke. Wasting time. But anyways, this is the Section 5 Critical Habitat Designation provision, and it essentially requires that critical habitat be designated for a listed species within 1 year of the listing of that species. However, it's not actually. I wonder if this applies solely to endangered. I don't have it on here. I wonder if this applies to only threatened or only to endangered, or I imagine it would be towards both threatened and endangered, but I'm not 100%. I might have to look into this because that would be another possible management, restriction if this is only to endangered versus threatened. But I think it's both, but I'll have to double check. But anyways, it requires that critical habitat be designated at most 1 year post listing of a species. And like I said earlier, after that 1978 amendment, it's not solely based on that best scientific information, but it's also those economic considerations or just particular considerations for that area. And then we kind of going back to the Section 7 Jeopardy clause. There's no it prohibits the adverse destruction and modification of said critical habitat, which we saw in the TVA versus Hill case, that that dam was going to adversely modify that critical habitat and jeopardize the species. And essentially, critical habitat is just designated to provide food and shelter for those listed species, to promote recovery of a listed species. What is one benefit? Okay, I do got slides for this one. What is one benefit to non-federal actors / permittees involved in a habitat conservation plan? So in the 1982, there's a new couple more, or there's some amendments to the ESA again, and this is this kind of gets into the authorization of incidental take permits, as we'll see here. I'm trying to lose my train of thought here now on this one. But anyways, okay, benefits to non-federal actors and permittees. So you have these private landowners who are subject to the Section 9 taking provision. And so essentially what this, the Section 10 habitat conservation plans allows is a landowner to, actually I'm going to go to the next slide, it's a little better. So anyways, yeah. So the Section 10 allows landowners to, submit a conservation plan that's designed to, minimize and mitigate the impact of development activities on protected species. And these are, called habitat conservation plans, HCPs. And so essentially, the private landowner, forms one of these, writes it up, and then they send it, to the, the administering agency. It's referred to as the secretary for a, and then, in the review, it's open to public review and comment, as well as the secretary. And the secretary is just looking for things like, or looking for, that the takings will be incidental to the action, that the applicant will, to the maximum extent practicable, minimize and mitigate the impacts of such taking. The applicant will ensure that the adequate funding will be provided for the plan, and that other measures will be met. So, if the secretary looks at the HCP and he finds all those things to be adequately, sufficient in the plan, then the secretary, and then additionally, the secretary is, required to determine that the proposed take will not appreciably reduce the survival of the and recovery of the species in the wild. So essentially, he has to ensure that the taking is not going to jeopardize the continued existence of that species. Kind of similar to the incidental take statement, where it's like, a couple might get caught in the crossfire, but the whole species is not going to be destroyed by this, by these incidental takes with these actions. And then, so after that public review and comment, and the secretary finds all these things to be sufficient, the secretary may issue an incidental take permit. And that incidental take permit, removes the liability of potentially, some punishment for an incidental taking, by this action. So it allows that, that landowner, it gives the landowner an incentive to maintain and, minimize and mitigate, since they have that incidental take statement, or, in order to get that incidental take permit, it incentivizes them to take those steps to promote a conservation of that, listed species, and, with the removal of that liability in the end being the goal. And so, and then, even going further, in 1994, there's that the no surprises policy is published. And essentially this extends the HCP, benefits a little bit too, beyond just an incidental take permit, but it, it essentially, that deal is a deal. Landowners who enter into an HCP for a listed species on their property will not be required to pay more or provide additional land for mitigation, regardless of changing species needs over time. So once they're in that HCP under the no surprises clause or policy, they're pretty good. I mean, then they don't have to worry about changing what they're doing, as long as they're in that HCP. There is the extraordinary circumstances provision, but for the most part, it's like, if you've done that HCP correctly, then you're pretty good. You get that incidental take permit. That removes that liability if you say you do incidentally take a listed species, as well as, under that no surprises policy, you don't have to worry about spending more or doing more to mitigate if there's there's changes to the criteria for managing for those endangered species. And that does extend to the unlisted species as well. So if a landowner were to address an unlisted species in their habitat conservation plan, mitigate measures in mitigating acts towards an unlisted species in that HCP, then say that unlisted species is to be listed down the road, then they won't have to worry as long as it's addressed in the HCP under that no surprises policy. They don't have to go and redo their plan. They're good to go. But yeah, so that's kind of, I would definitely say that's that benefits the landowner. That reduction of liability, and then the no surprises policy. The not having to increase funding or changing your management style, maybe changing how you're doing things on your property under that. So the no surprises policy, and the reduction of liability on the landowner, the reduction of litigation and penalty. Okay. A little long-winded for that. That was a 5-pointer, but I just kept going. What is one benefit for a listed species covered by a habitat conservation plan? So, I mean, it's pretty similar. Like, the way I see it, it's pretty similar, and in the book, like, it's similar to the landowner. So if the landowner is incentivized to create this habitat conservation plan with these minimizing and mitigating actions in order to remove that liability off their hands, they're gonna by doing they're gonna be much more accepting and willing to have those endangered and listed species around. So they're gonna maybe without that habitat conservation and that liability protection that it affords them, they'd be much more liable to just destroy all the habitat, so there's no chance that any endangered or listed species could live on their land, so they don't have to change what they're doing, and they don't have to worry about incidental take. Or there's also the shoot, shovel, and shut up as well, which is mentioned in the book. If you're not in that habitat conservation plan, and maybe you say you spot some an endangered species on your property, you might just want to shoot it, bury it, and not say anything about it, because if someone were to find out you had that endangered species on your property, you're going to have to change the way you do things. You're going to have to manage for it. You're going to have to take steps to avoid takes. So, with that habitat conservation plan, it encourages, it's an incentive for landowners to make their lands more habitable to, these endangered and listed species, versus without those habitat conservation plans, where the landowners might be more incentivized or might be perverse incentivized to make their land uninhabitable, or just try to kill and keep them under the presence of endangered species under wraps. So I guess one benefit to those listed species under the HCPs is that they become more acceptable to be kept, to have them around for the landowner. I'll try more water. Making decent time, I guess. How does the concept of multiple use differ from the ESA's no jeopardy provision? Be sure to discuss administrative discretion and the role of the courts, and generally how they generally view these laws in your answer. So let's see. I know I got this one. Maybe. Yeah. Okay. So, kind of going back to multiple use, throwing it back to test 2 here, but on the slide here, I got FLIPMA section 202 C1, secretary shall use and observe the principles of multiple use in the land planning process, and then defines multiple use of as management of the public lands utilized in the combination of balanced and diverse resource uses, including but not limited to recreation, range, timber, minerals, watershed, wildlife and fish, and natural, scenic, scientific, and historical values. No prohibitions in the statute or definition or of multiple use or in the mandate. No weights placed on any particular multiple uses that either. It's just that multiple uses, that balancing of those competing uses, whether it is, range and timber or wildlife and recreation, scenic values. Pretty wide ranging, like I said, multiple use, balancing of those competing uses. And like, going back to the Perkins v. Berglund case, when they're discussing the language of the multiple use mandate as found in the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act for the Forest Service, there are general clauses and phrases that can hardly be considered concrete limits on agency discretion, and they breathe discretion at every pore. So they just show how much discretion they afford to that agency who's managing for those multiple use. Very discretionary. Very discretionary. No weight placed on any certain multiple use to be managed for. And then there was the one case here I do got is that comb wash allotment case, where there was we did see a limit on that discretion, and it was where that the BLM had failed to show that they had in a reasoned and informed way balanced the competing multiple uses for the comb wash allotment by approving grazing on that allotment based solely on a programmatic EIS. And the San Jose RMP and the programmatic EIS, they didn't show that they had adequately balanced the other multiple uses of that allotment before they went ahead on it. So there has been that was like the one the big case we talked about, at least, where the courts did limit the discretion of the agency a little bit. So broadly, multiple use, very discretionary. Not a lot of limits on the discretion of the agency, as long as they show that balanced and informed, reasoned and informed, balanced decision making of the multiple uses on that land. They're pretty free to be managed for whatever multiple use they find. Then moving on to the this slide doesn't really pertain, but I don't think I got one for this either. But anyway, moving on to the Section 7 no jeopardy provision. So it's got that, I might have, I got 7. I screw around with the stinking PowerPoint more than it's probably worth it. But anyways, that Section 7 no jeopardy provision is, it's got enforceable and substantive language, as we saw in TVA versus Hill. Each agency shall ensure that that any action is not likely to jeopardize the continued existence of an endangered species or endangered or threatened species or result in the destruction or adverse modification of habitat. So that's some pretty, there's some enforceable language there for sure. You got that shall right off the bat, not shall ensure that agency action is not likely to jeopardize, so there's enforceable language in there right off the bat. It's directing the agency on what not to do. And then, I mentioned, TVA versus Hill again, where, that river was designated critical habitat, and the agency action in this case, they didn't ensure, I guess, that they were, that action they were committing was not going to, they didn't ensure that it wasn't going to not jeopardize the species, continued existence of the snail darter or critically modify that habitat. And it results in the courts placing an injunction on that dam and halting the dam altogether, halting the agency action. We didn't see, like I said, the only time we kind of saw that with multiple use was when they just didn't show that they had balanced balanced those competing multiple uses. Here it's a lot more cut. They're pretty cut and dry. And it shows the teeth of that Section 7 no jeopardy provision, where that agency it shows that those agencies have to ensure that they're not going to adversely modify or jeopardize continued existence of a species. In a nutshell, how is the ESA different than NEPA in terms of its substantive obligations? Please be sure to discuss jeopardy and the no-take provisions of the ESA. Why has the judiciary been significant in the development of both laws? Please explain with an example and be sure to reference TVA versus Hill. TVA versus Hill is very popular in the ESA, in the lore of the ESA, which is, makes sense. It's a pretty straightforward case to follow, and it's also just pretty epic, I guess. Even though I think, the dam ended up being built a couple years later. I can't remember why, but it was built. But the snail darter they found it somewhere else, and it's still kicking. Anyways, going back to, so throwing it back to NEPA, test 1 again, a little bit of review, tossing it back. But Section 102 of NEPA, the action forcing mechanism, you have that, it applies to all major federal actions, significantly affecting the quality of the human environment. And in this section, you have the requirements of an EIS and when an EIS is required. But, it's those foreseeable environmental effects, those adverse environmental effects that cannot be avoided, reasonable range of alternatives and those effects of the, potential effects of those alternatives, short-term uses and maintenance of the long-term productivity, the irreversible and irretrievable commitments of federal resources. And then there's kind of the big part here. I think this is probably the most substantive part of NEPA, because NEPA is, it's referred to as as a largely procedural law. But to me, at least, what seems to be the most procedural part, and we'll see in some case history, or in that case history that I'll bring up, but is that it requires that the EIS shall accompany the proposal through the existing agency review process. So, going to the Calvert-Cliffs versus the Atomic Energy Commission case, there was that the Atomic Energy Commission, they had conducted the EIS, they had gone through the procedural requirements of the EIS. They'd conducted it, they'd done all the alternatives, but they put it in an envelope and they didn't even consider it. Like, they just put it in an envelope and, we did the EIS. But they didn't consider it, and it just kind of passed through. Well, they got litigated for it, and they were, actually, I don't even remember what the outcome of this case was. But essentially, what the courts found is that, determined that these agencies need to not only do the procedural requirements of the EIS, but they need to do the substantive and take that hard look at those findings of the EIS and actually consider them to the fullest extent possible in their decision making, which the Atomic Energy Commission did not. And I don't know. All I got on here is that they remanded the Atomic Energy Commission. I'm not really sure what the punishment was in this case, so I'll have to go back and review that. But anyways, yeah, essentially, so with NEPA, if an agency follows the procedural requirements of Section 102, they, the only thing they are really bound by is that substantive requirement to take that hard look and fully, fullest extent possible, in their decision making. Take a hard look at those findings of the EIS to the fullest extent possible in their decision making. So, ESA Section 7, Jeopardy and Consultation, Section 7 and 9 both have those substantive, enforceable language. It requires, Section 7, only directed to federal actors' actions, but it requires that, the agency action will not jeopardize the continued existence of a listed species or modify habitat, destroy or adversely modify habitat. And then, as we saw in TVA versus Hill again, the findings of, listing of snail darter, designation of Little Tennessee River as critical habitat. The dam will adversely modify that critical habitat and jeopardize the continued existence of the snail darter. Courts enjoin the dam for violating Section 7 Jeopardy Clause. Consultation, Jeopardy provision. It shows the teeth of Section 7 and the ESA. But then, so we got, the Section 9, unlawful for any person to take any such species. So not only federal, but everyone who's, subject to U.S. jurisdiction, I guess. makes it unlawful for anyone to take any listed species within the U.S. or territorial sea. The definition of take, like we talked about earlier: harass, harm, pursue, shoot, hunt, wound, kill, trap, capture, collect, or attempt to engage in any such conduct. And then, going back to the Palila versus the Hawaii Department of Natural Resources case, where you have that, um, you got the introduction of those goats by the Hawaii Department of Natural Resources. Those goats go about eating the mamane tree seedlings and shoots, potential future habitat. So not affecting the current, living Palila, but adversely modifying and destroying that future habitat for future Palila. And then, so in this case, they determined that this constitutes as harm, this constitutes as an indirect take, and therefore the Hawaii Department of Natural Resources is guilty of it, and they are, they're forced to remove the goats from the island. I think, what else do I got here? What else do I have to say for this one? I don't even know if I answered the question, to be honest with you. I just went off reading stuff. I think I actually got it. Judiciary, yes. I mentioned how the courts have interpreted these. Substantive, yes. All right, I'm just going to keep going. What is the most significant program in the U.S. supporting the acquisition of private lands into federal and public land ownership for the purposes of access and conservation? Where does this funding come from? So this is the Land and Water Conservation Fund. I should make a slide for this one because it'd be easy. Land and Water Conservation Fund. It's a $900 million per year appropriation, and this has been provided in it's prior to the Great American Outdoors Act. It was a yearly appropriation from Congress, and then following the Great American Outdoors Act, I guess would it just be part of the budget then? I don't know. I guess I haven't read the Great American Outdoors Act, so I'm not really sure. I guess it would just be an appropriation by law instead of Congress having to vote on it to appropriate it. I don't know. I'll have to look into that. But anyways, a lot of this $900 million per year is coming from the royalties from offshore federal oil and gas development. That's a 5-pointer. So it's yeah, and essentially, I think what are a lot of that land is that's being acquired with this fund. From what I remember in the reading, is that it's these lands that are adjacent to national parks, and say that there's a big private ranch right there and it goes up for sale. They can they use this fund to add it to the park and purchase it. I think that was, from what I remember from the reading, one of the places that these funds are kind of commonly used. What is the power given to the president? Oh, I can go to the Antiquities Act slide, I guess. That slide takes forever to get onto. I don't like that transition. That transition sucks. All right, so what is the power given to the president by the Antiquities Act of 1906? So, in this act, Congress gave the president the authority to declare by a public proclamation historic landmarks, historic and prehistoric structures, and other objects owned or controlled by the government to be national monuments and may reserve them as part thereof parcels of land, confined to the smallest area compatible. I shortened it up a little bit in my answer there, but essentially, this gives Congress gave the president the authority to reserve sections or chunks of federal land for certain uses, or to limit certain multiple he has the authority to limit uses, or limit certain multiple uses on those chunks of land, and preserve certain values of the lands, whether that be historical, archaeological, objects of scientific interest. So it gives, and one of the common themes with these national monuments is that these lands are often at least withdrawn from mineral access, mining, and mineral entry, as well as a president could withdraw it from, he could close it off from grazing, he could theoretically close it off from hunting if he wanted to. I don't think that's a very common one, but they could. So essentially, it gives the president, authority to, change. Yeah, I don't know. I already answered that. What power was given to the president by the Antiquities Act of 1906? On what constitutional basis can Congress provide this power to the president? Why has the designation of national monuments caused conflict or controversy in the past? Please explain, focusing on one particular area of conflict or controversy, and be as specific as possible. So Congress gave. What time is it? Jeez, it's about 1. All right. So I guess I'll probably have to wrap up kind of soon. Congress gave the president the authority to reserve areas of federal land for certain uses, or to limit certain multiple uses, to preserve certain values of the land, historic, prehistoric, object of historic and scientific interest. So, like I just mentioned in the last one, limiting uses or restricting access. Placing limits on multiple uses, mining withdrawals, mineral entry withdrawals. And Congress provides this power to the president pursuant to the property clause of the Constitution. All needful Congress has the power to make all needful rules and regulations. What was it? For all property. United States. I can't remember it. And then kind of a legacy of controversy with this with the Antiquities Act has definitely been one particular area of conflict or controversy, and be as specific as possible. So it's that I think one area of conflict that's definitely been prolific is that smallest area compatible, and is there any limit to the size of a national monument that a president can declare a national monument? And the answer in short is no, at least in the eyes of the courts, and in the history of the Antiquities Act. Not that presidents have gone crazy with it, but they've definitely they're not constrained. But anyways, an example going back to the Theodore Roosevelt's proclamation of the Grand Canyon National Park or National Monument, which would eventually become a national park. But, initially, Grand Canyon was a national monument declared by Theodore Roosevelt, 800,000 acres. And he's challenged by this fellow, Ralph Cameron, who had a couple mining claims around the rim of the Grand Canyon, in the Grand Canyon. He had been using these claims to charge visitors access fees into the canyon along trails. But eventually, I think he had been challenged on the validity of his claims. Essentially, somehow he ends up in the Supreme Court. I can't remember the full details of how he ended up in the Supreme Court, but he challenges Theodore Roosevelt's proclamation of the Grand Canyon, and the Supreme Court comes to Theodore's back on this one, and they say courts found that the Grand Canyon is an object of unusual scientific interest. And they just, they give some description of the Grand Canyon. It's the greatest eroded canyon in the U.S., over a mile deep. Regarded as one of the greatest natural wonders. So, they find that, Theodore Roosevelt was in the right in proclaiming this a national monument, because it falls within that object of scientific interest. And they didn't even really address the size of it. They determined that the size of the monument wasn't disqualifying if the protected object was of scientific interest. So if it met that other criteria, then the size doesn't matter, essentially, or is not important. And even more specifically, we had the Tulare County versus Bush case, where there was a challenge on Clinton's designation of the giant sequoia? I might just combine this with the next question, because they're very similar. But so it challenges President Clinton's designation of giant sequoia national monument, and the plaintiffs argued that the monument was not confined to the smallest area compatible. But the courts come back and they say that no, the Antiquities Act does not oblige a president to make a meaningful investigation or determination of the smallest area necessary to protect any specified objects or scientific interests. So essentially what they say there is that, well, it's, there's no language in the act that says that president needs to consult with anybody else, to determine, well, what is the smallest area compatible for this monument. That's totally up there, and it's all in the president's discretion what the smallest confined area, or the smallest area compatible is. So there's nothing in the act that says like, shall be confined to the smallest area compatible as determined with best available science. There's no best available science mandate in the Antiquities Act. It's the only mandate is in his discretion. And like to combine this with the next question, which essentially asks, it asks the first few parts I think are pretty much the same, and then it asks, it asks you to take a side of, could the president use this act more expansively? I think is that crap. Let me check it. Yeah, make a substantiated argument for or against a more expansive use of the Antiquities Act by a president, um, and then reference the actual text of the statute. So, I mean, just based off the results of the, Tulare County versus Bush case and the, the Roosevelt or Cameron versus U.S., I think the president could be really, they could use this as expansively, theoretically. I mean, I think the only thing that's truly limiting what the president, that, I mean, really, aside from, I mean, it's literally like the fact that it has to be on lands, controlled by the U.S. And then there was the Jackson, in the Jackson Hole case where FDR had declared that Jackson Hole National Monument. In that case, it was a very unpopular national monument. He was getting a lot of, I think he had been litigated by the state of Wyoming, and Congress actually withheld the funds for that national monument until they reached Truman came in and reached a compromise, and essentially now no longer can they proclaim national monuments in Wyoming. But that was like one of the times where, I guess Congress can withhold funding, and Congress can withhold funding, and I think that was kind of the big one. And then of course, more recently, President Trump had used the Antiquities Act to de-designate and shrink national monuments, which is, it's ambiguous. It's not really sure if that's, within the act. I guess there's nothing in the act saying that they can't do that. So it's, it's in his, like I said, just looking at the language of the act, in his discretion, and so it, like going back to that, I'm way off topic, but so. I mean, essentially, like I said, with the Tulare County, and they, what the courts found there is that it is the president. It's solely the president's discretion to determine what the smallest area compatible is. So there's really, like I said, there's not that best available science mandate. There's no mandate stating considering economic effects to the local economies or anything like that. It's solely the president's discretion. So I think, in this case, you could argue for that. You could argue that they could use, presidents could use this more expansively if they wanted to. It would be very unpopular, I think, and their want to be reelected is probably one of the biggest, limits on discretion for using this act. From a designation standpoint, I'll go to this slide. From a designation standpoint, how is the U.S. Forest Service roadless rule different than federal wilderness? So, federal wilderness are designated by Congress in statute, and the Forest Service then, pursuant to the Wilderness Act, conducted these roadless area review and evaluation, Rare 1 and 2, where they went out and they inventoried the forests, and they found all these these large these potential wildernesses, and they designated them as inventory roadless areas, IRAs. So these IRAs are designated by the U.S. Forest Service. Does federal wilderness provide greater protection to lands than those covered by the roadless rule and those designated and managed as areas of critical environmental concern by the BLM? Please explain and substantiate, and be sure to tell me what you mean by greater. So here on this slide, I kind of just have like a little bit of a stack ranking, I guess, of protection. Now, in this case, I've interpreted protection to kind of mean, I guess like first off, uh, who designates these? In the Wilderness Act, like I mentioned in the last question, is designated by Congress in statute, whereas the roadless rule and the BLM ACECs are, these are inventoried and designated by the Forest Service, and these ACECs are, designated by, BLM officials in the planning process. So these are both designated by, by the agencies. This is by Congress. So, this is obviously going to be a lot more difficult to change or amend or do anything with, whereas these two, these are much more susceptible to change, changing pendulum swings, changing politics, changing, agents, changing agendas for the executive. So, I think that would probably be like kind of first and foremost how I've interpreted protection is what, are they more susceptible to change? Are they more permanent? And then additionally, like, I also went on to kind of say that it's like, it's the limits placed on the, which of these places the most limits on the these agencies, that are managing them's discretion to what these lands are used for or planning decisions. So, just kind of starting at the top, you have the Wilderness Act. It's got that unimpairment mandate, unimpaired for future use, preservation of a wilderness character. So there's kind of a dominant use mandate right there, preserving for that wilderness character, protected and managed so as to preserve its natural conditions. And, like I said, it's still kind of that dominant use, preserving and managing to preserve natural conditions. And then, it also comes with that additional Section 4C prohibitions list, that no roads, permanent or temporary, commercial enterprise, no motor vehicles, no motorized equipment, no motor boats, no landing of aircraft, no mechanical transport, which includes bicycles, and no structures or installation. So that Wilderness Act, it's with the without the exceptions, of course, to these, but it provides, it's like I said, one, it's statutory by Congress, so it's very, it'd be very difficult to change or amend. But then it's also got these, this extensive prohibition list, and it's all, and then it's also got these mandates, for these agencies to, unimpairment and managing and preserving natural conditions. Then kind of moving down to these two. So first off, yeah, they're implemented by the agency, so they're prone to change, and we see that with the 2005 roadless rule, which I'm not going to get into. The professor said not to mess with it for this exam, but essentially, yeah. So these are they don't have that congressional protection. They're not like I said, they're like they're very liable to change with changing executives and that pendulum swing of of goals of an agency, of the president and the executive as a whole. Anyway, the inventory roadless rule did come with it has a couple prohibitions written into it by the agency. I think it was no road construction, and then there's it's I don't know, timber harvests except I think are prohibited except for certain situations they are allowed. But so there's a couple prohibitions. Essentially, it is it does kind of call for that management of that natural character that is or wilderness like character. And then you have those BLM ACECs, which similar to the roadless rule are agency promulgated, and they're found like I said, Flipma 202 here. Secretary shall give priority to the designation and consideration of ACECs during the land use planning process. And these ACECs are areas where special management attention is required to prevent and protect against irreparable damage to significant resources. So within the ACECs, there's no direct prohibitions. That's it's going to be determined in that land process, that RMP process, as to what's going to be restricted on these ACECs. And like is there going to be, are there going to be road closures? Is there going to be buffer zones for sage grouse? flex? Are we going to withdraw it from mineral leasing? So that's all determined in the land process, planning process. However, like that is susceptible to change. Maybe the next time, next round of planning, or maybe they amend that ACEC, they can change those restrictions as needed. And similar to, this can be changed as well. So, just based on the level of protection, these two are, like I said, much more susceptible to change. This is pretty much not going to change. It's congressional statute unless it was, it would be very difficult to change. And then just the protections within them, or the limitations on agency discretion, is also much more strong in this than these two. I'm pretty much, I gotta wrap up, so I'm gonna call it here. But yeah, thanks.